It's your weekend show with Bob Bierman.
If you listened last week, we took a journey through music beginning around 1970, and we spent around 3 years reminiscing. And I shared some things that had occurred in my life in high school, and as I began this journey of life, we talk about frequently here on your weekend show. Today I want to kind of complete the program I started last week and share a few forgotten songs and things that occurred back in the early 1970s. Maybe you're around my age, and a lot of the music I'll share are songs you will know. Even if you're a bit older, you probably know them well, and if you're younger, some of them have been around for a long time and are still popular to this day among many people. I hope that as I complete this program of memories, it'll be of help to you and maybe help put your life in perspective. Of late, I've been thinking a lot about the things that I'm called to do, the things that I'm wanting to do, the things that I should be doing, and trying to get a handle on all the life experience that I have been granted. It then begs the question, what do you do with all this life experience? All of us go through a very similar process. We come into this world, and we are very dependent upon our parents to take care of us, and then we learn by doing. We receive an education. And I know that when I was 16 years old, 14 years old, I thought I knew everything there was to know. When I started working in radio, and by the time I had turned 18 and I'm already working almost 2 years on air, I thought I was ready to run a radio station. I mean, it's so easy. You just have to know what records to play and what to say on the air. I would be thoroughly successful. But I had a lot of learning yet to do. And over the next several years, a lot of changes occurred in just a matter of 3 and 4 years that changed my way of thinking about a lot of stuff. And we're going to talk about that today as we reminisce here on your weekend show. I want to also let you know that next weekend, I'm going to begin a different series of programs that deal with issues that I think are very important, yet we talk about them, but I don't think that we really comprehend this changing world that we live in and some of the things we better be prepared to deal with in the not-too-distant future. The world goes in cycles, and we'll discuss that a lot next weekend on your weekend show.
Everybody ready? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, listen.
It's your weekend show.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
With Bob Bierman.
It's great.
It was the fall of 1973 when we left off last weekend. I had shared with you where I had been since 1970, finishing up high school, beginning my first job, moving away from home, going to school, being disappointed, facing some of the realities of life. And now I was heading back to New York State from South Carolina to continue my education. It's now 1973, going into 1974. The music is beginning to change a little bit. We're seeing the beginnings of a new trend called disco. And the world is changing too. Here's a song recorded in 1973 that became one of the biggest hits of 1974, The Sound of Philadelphia. Welcome back to your weekend show. I'm your host, Bob Bierman. Once again, we're completing something we started last weekend, a little musical journey. The last time I did a program, anything like this, was way back in the early days of your weekend show, and we're talking back around the 5th of December of 2015. We took a musical journey through a series of years. And I thought today and last week would be a good time to maybe reminisce a little bit. I turned 65 years old last year, and I'll turn 66 toward the end of this year, so I'm going to enjoy not being 66 for as long as I can. And I know a lot of the folk that do listen to this program, especially those that listen by shortwave, they're definitely in the baby boomer generation like I am, and some even older. And so a number of these songs that I'm playing today and some that I played last week are songs you may remember. I've tried to find a few songs that you haven't heard in a long time. It's amazing. You can look at the charts from some of the various years that we grew up. And there were songs that meant a whole lot to us, but for some reason, when you go to a lot of the oldies radio stations you find in the United States and Canada and even in the UK, there are a lot of forgotten songs, but there's some memories attached. I've learned one thing in my life, maybe it's true with yours, that we oftentimes attach things to our memories. Maybe the certain smells and things of flowers and the ocean or a forest or whatever the case may be. We also attach music, and we attach some of our emotions and feelings. And I just wanted to take a break from the world these 2 weeks to go back in time. And maybe for some of you like me, even though life was not always easy 20, 30, 40, even 50 years ago, going through my teenage years and starting out in the world, and I'm sure a lot of you that are listening know exactly what I'm talking about. I can honestly say, in spite of all of the difficult things that I had to deal with in my home life, in my personal life, in the early days of my professional life, I can honestly say life was a lot easier back then. It didn't seem to have the complications that we seem to be so consumed by today. Now, I've always been a person that believes heavily in technology, because technology is a useful tool if it is used correctly. Any tool that is used incorrectly is never a good thing. You know, it's hard to use a screwdriver as a hammer. It doesn't really work well. And a hammer's not something you want to do when you're dealing with delicate things that break easily. All of the things we have today in computers and technology, all of it, can be useful tools, but they can also be huge distractions. A few weeks ago, we actually talked about things that are opportunities and things that are distractions. And I look back to the 1970s, and some of you may look back to the 1960s or even 1950s, and remember a simpler time in a world that, even though there were complexities, even though there were dangers and fears, I mean, look, I remember the duck and cover drills in elementary school. I attended a school, a Lutheran school, I might add, in Long Island, about 35 air miles due east of New York City and Manhattan. And we were always told as little kids, I mean, the basement of our school was a fallout shelter that was well stocked, I guess, in case the Russians dropped a bomb or a missile on New York City. When we saw the flash, we only had so many seconds to get under our desk before the atomic blast would probably shatter our windows. 35 miles away. People in that era were building in our neighborhood. They were building fallout shelters in their homes. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 put a lot of people in fear. I get it. And so in the 1960s, we were in this Cold War and always wondering if we would get through the 1960s in the back of our mind. Yet for some reason we did. As the 60s progressed, the concern for most people was the war in Vietnam, and we thought less about the Russian threat. We thought less about the East German threat or any of the Chinese threat as they went through their cultural revolution. We began to think primarily in terms of our nation, our country, our now young people in elementary school, high school, and even entering college in the 70s that are the baby boomers. And there were quite a few of us coming through at that time. And the world had a lot of optimism in spite of the difficulties, in spite of the protest. I can remember I was getting ready to enter high school, and I can remember all the riots and things that were happening in places like East Los Angeles, Newark, New Jersey, and a bunch of other cities in the summer of 1968. I can remember all the violence in Chicago at the Democrat National Convention. I was a young guy, but I was aware of the world around us in the news. It's just the way things were back in those days. If you listen to Top 40 radio like I did back in the 1960s and 1970s, and then I got a job working as a Top 40 radio announcer by 1971. And if you listen to Top 40 radio, every hour, either on the hour or in some cases at 5 minutes before the hour, and other stations had different times, there was a newscast. There was generally a newscast on virtually every radio station, including the top 40 radio stations. ABC, Contemporary News, I can remember it well. And we would listen to the news that would start out like this. From way back in the 1960s into the 1970s, ABC News on many top 40 radio stations started with that news sounder. Maybe that's one of the reasons that we, coming along in our time, in our era, knew a little bit more about the world around us today than many of our counterparts at the same age in this day and age do. A lot of people just listen to their music. They watch their movies. They never pay attention to news. And what little news they get maybe on Facebook, which could be faker than fake could be. It's the world we live in today compared to the one that we came through back then. And I'm sharing some memories from the 1970s. Last weekend, I took you through a journey starting when I was in high school to the time that I finished high school, graduated, went on to an electronics school, and where I left the story off last weekend was heading back to New York State, where I had been raised. I lived in Long Island, then upstate near Lake Ontario, but it was time to go back to school again, and my grandparents in Long Island were really pressuring me to go to St. John's University, which is what I did. And I will tell you that period of time in my life was a great experience. My grades were excellent. I learned a lot. And a lot of who I am today occurred during that time. I can remember being in the car and driving. I commuted every day. I remember the gas crisis well, and the lines, the odd and even days. Do you remember those days of having to wait to get gas and only could get a maximum of 10 gallons every other day because there was a gas shortage? I remember those days myself. And I can remember driving and hearing songs like this on the radio.
Midnight at the Oasis, sing your camel to bed. Shadows painting our faces, traces of romance in our heads. Heaven's holding a half moon, shining just for us. Let's slip off to a sand dune real soon. Kick up a little dust. Come on, cactus is our friend. He'll point out the way. Come on, till the evening ends. Till the evening ends. You don't have to answer. There's no need to speak. I'll be your belly dancer, prancer, and you can be my sheep. I know your daddy's a sultan, a nomad known to all, with 50 girls to attend him. They all send him a jump man's beck and call. But you won't need no harem, honey, when I'm by your side. And you won't need no camel, no, no, when I take you for a ride. Come on, cactus is our friend. He'll point out the way. Come on, till the evening ends, till the evening ends. Midnight at the Oasis, sing your camel to bed. Got shadows painting our faces and traces of romance in our head. Oh, come on, come on. Oh, come on. Ooh, yeah.
One of those forgotten songs from the 1970s for many, Maria Muldaur and Midnight at the Oasis. You know, I was thinking as that song was playing, a lot of what happened in 1973 and the first part of 1974 as I was back at school for another year. And the influences on my life at that time and things that are now a part of who I am forever that occurred in just those years. When you look from basically 1970 to 1975, a lot of who I became and a lot of the direction and the values and the foundations of my life were pretty much established as I look back now. One of the things that I was deeply involved with during my college time, being that I was living again on Long Island, it wasn't that bad of a drive to go back to my hometown and the church that I attended. Now, while I liked my grandparents' church, how do I put it politely? I was basically in my late teens. I'm 19. And I'm thinking, I really don't want to go to their church because they're primarily an older congregation, set in their ways. Nice people, don't get me wrong. The church that I had attended, not that many miles farther to the east, had a school, so there were a lot of younger people. And a lot of people in that town that I still knew from not that many years before. When I was much younger, growing up in the 1960s, I sang in the children's choir and made my way into the mixed choir. And now that I'm back in the area, about 5 or so years later, it was nice to go back to a church that I knew, people that I knew, the same choir master and organist that I knew, the same pastor that I had known my entire growing up life, and to become actively involved again in the church of my youth. But there were a lot of other things going on in that period of time in the 1970s. Within that church, there was a movement. There was kind of a renewal going on in people's lives. It was the time of the Jesus people, remember that? And some of the new contemporary Christian music that was making its way around the country. And I discovered some of that music, and a lot of it means a lot to me to this very day. There was a radio station out of New Jersey that you could hear. That's back when AM radio was king. It's before FM was even popular. And I can remember listening to this radio station quite often. I had a button set for it. WWDJ out of Hackensack, New Jersey. And they were playing a lot of contemporary Christian music and teaching programs, the likes of which I had never really heard before. I had worked at a Christian radio station in Ohio when I was in electronics school, and I heard some of the, what I would call, old-time preachers of the day, but I had never heard the kind of teaching and the style. This is all new to me back in 1973 and 1974. And to hear songs like this playing on the radio, well, it really did touch my heart. By the way, this is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Bierman. We're taking a little journey down memory lane. And if you like this program, why not let me know? We're going to be changing gears next weekend and getting into some very important topics. As I look at the future of this radio show and podcast, I'm really thinking about a few things that I need your input on. And how can I best serve you is my question. And we'll be talking about that next weekend. But right now, I want to share with you a song that goes back to around early 1974. And one that really spoke to my heart back in that day. It's Honey Tree and Clean Before My Lord.
Clean before my Lord I stand, and in me not one blemish does he see. When I placed all my burdens on him, he washed them all from me.
period of time of 1973 into 1974 was a very life-changing period of time. I didn't even see it at the time. I just went through it and experienced it, enjoyed it. I really loved my time at St. John's University, opening my mind and my eyes to the industry that I loved, as communications, as radio, and I had a whole different attitude about it very quickly and embraced the possibilities of what could be done with this incredible medium that I was privileged to be a part. I talked a little bit before that these years, 1970 to 1975, were a time of great opportunity, but they were also a time of some struggle, heartbreak, and some very serious disappointment. I look back at it now, and I should be angry about some of the things that occurred, especially in the middle part of 1974, that I never anticipated happening within my own family, that made some significant changes in the direction of my life. We talk often here on this program about how something that somebody says or does can have a huge impact and completely, totally change the direction of your life. And being that I was still young, I had learned a lot, but I hadn't learned everything about life and people and personality. Maybe I was still sheltered enough in my own way to think that even family members would never do you wrong. And it's something that impacted me heavily for many, many years. If you had listened last week, and I had told you about the time that I had gotten to Ohio and my father had separated from my mother. My mother was sent off to South Carolina. That's one of the reasons I went down there for a while waiting to go back to school to spend a little bit of time with that part of the family. I didn't see that often. My father had struck up a new relationship and had gotten married in the latter part of 1973 to a woman in upstate New York that he apparently knew. I knew of her but never knew her. I knew her son. He and I were in the same grade together, and that's kind of how I knew them. And I was living at my grandparents' house in Port Washington, New York, which is on Manhasset Bay, beautiful place. And I'm enjoying my time in college. My grades are excellent. I'm involved with clubs. I'm learning. I'm deeply involved in my church on the weekends and in the middle of the week. I had a very full schedule in life. And it was Easter time in 1974. My dad and his new wife came down to my grandparents' house. They lived upstate, so it's about a 6-7 hour drive. They didn't come that often. And my father and his new bride took me aside. And it still hurts my heart to this day when I think now what happened and what could have been, what may have should have been. But I accept completely where I ended up. And in so many ways, I really don't have any regrets. But my father takes me aside. Now, I had an older brother. He was in college. And my father is, talking about how difficult it is, and maybe I shouldn't be living here. I'm putting a lot of stress and strain on my grandparents, and maybe I should consider, just finishing up with my 2-year stuff and maybe, go back to work for a while, and if you want more education later, save up for it. And I listened to what he said, and I received it. I should not have received that. But I made the decision then. I didn't say anything to anybody, that I would finish out and get my 2 years done. And I decided to go back to my old job in upstate New York. My dad said that he knew that they were always looking where I had worked at, and they would be probably happy to have me back. And so I finished my schooling for the year in 1974, and by June, I headed to upstate New York, and I rented a small room in a little apartment house and took a job where I had first started in radio a few years before. My grandparents thought I was going to be coming back to school in September. And then I explained to them that I really was going to stay doing this. We never really talked about it. And it surprised them that why would I walk away from going to 4 years of college and just being happy at this point with 2. It took years to find out why, and I'll tell you that in a moment. I went to work at the old radio station that I had been at before. And it was also a time of the beginning of a bad economy. In that time, in 1974, the economy was not that great. And the radio station was going to have to lay people off. And being that I was hired as a assistant news person and part-time, radio announcer, I would be one of the easiest ones to let go, and I could see that. I survived a little longer by helping in selling advertising. It wasn't easy in a bad economy. And I knew that by the end of the year, my job would most likely be gone as we entered into 1975. I'm not going to go into all the details of what I decided to do. That's another program for another day. But I'll just say this. I enlisted. I'll give you the real brief story. There was a guy that came by the radio station every Saturday. He was an Air Force recruiter, and he convinced me to join the United States Air Force and go into Armed Forces radio television on a 6-year enlistment, guaranteed job. I could complete my college after I do my first 2 years, and it was really a great offer. And so I decided in October of 1974 to enter the Air Force in January of 1975. And I knew that I would have my job to the end of the year, and I could then make the transition. So I prepared myself to enter the United States Air Force, and that's exactly what I did. Shortly after the first of the year, I'm on my way to Lackland Air Force Base on Eastern Airlines, no doubt. From Syracuse to Atlanta, Atlanta to San Antonio. And we were getting through our time in basic training, and it became apparent they were trying to encourage a number of us that had guaranteed jobs to consider taking some money and going home early. I was pretty well informed that there would be no guaranteed job for me, and that the Air Force was very apologetic, and if I'd be willing to take a lot of money and be in the inactive reserve for 6 years and an honorable discharge, I could leave. Or my term would be converted to a 2-year enlistment with no guarantee of any job that I might want or advance in rank. And so I did the only thing you could do at that point in my life. I took the money and I took the honorable discharge, and I kept in touch with the Air Force for the next 6 years where I lived at in case something ever happened and they needed me again. They could bring me back anytime in those 6 years. And so that's where I did. And I left. And I was flying back. Oh, this has got to be the latter part of February. I had just about completed my 6 weeks basic training, and I'm on the way home, heading back towards Syracuse. And we stopped in Atlanta. And something just said, don't go back to Syracuse. Get off the plane here. Take some time, because Atlanta to where my mother was living in South Carolina is by bus just a couple of few hours. And so I went to the gate, went to one of the agents. This is way back in the 1970s. And I said, look, I'd like to get off here. Can I use this ticket later to go to Syracuse? And they were able to accommodate that. They said, sure, you can use this. It's just a pass. You just have to call and make sure you can get a seat. And so I decided to get off the plane. I had my duffel bag. I didn't even check my luggage. And I was able to find my way to the bus station and took a bus to Anderson, South Carolina from Atlanta, Georgia in February. And I decided I didn't want to go back to Syracuse. I felt so abandoned. My dad lived in the same town I did, and I never saw him. The radio station I had worked for really didn't need me, and I just felt it was not the place that I should be. So I thought maybe I would look around and see if I could get a job again in South Carolina for the time being. So I started looking at some of the radio jobs that were around, and there were several that I could take. I looked at an AM radio station in Belton, South Carolina, one in Abbeville, South Carolina. Matter of fact, this show is heard on one of those stations there now. And also one in Clemson, South Carolina. And I heard about one. I was told by the guy in Clemson there was an immediate opening coming up just across the state line in Toccoa, Georgia, about 30 miles south. He was nice enough to make a phone call, to call the owner of that radio station. He knew him. And I developed a friendship with this guy at that radio station in South Carolina, which comes into play later in my life. But I went ahead and I took a drive down to the little city of Toccoa, Georgia. And I got there I had seen this guy about 9:30 in the morning, and I left a little after 10 something and got there by 11 o'clock, did an interview, and the guy told me to go to lunch, and after lunch we'll talk some more. And he hoped I could stay a little longer that afternoon. I was hired at that radio station at the end of February in Toccoa, Georgia, in the same day that I met them. It's also the day that I met the woman that I married and was married to for 29 years until she passed away in 2004. And so these circumstances of my life, the way I ended up in Georgia, in the South, because my dad insisted that I consider dropping out of college even though my grades were good. It wasn't until many, many years later, in the early 1990s, my grandmother had never asked. My late wife and I traveled to New York frequently, at least once a year, to see them. We talked about a lot of things, but she never, ever said a word about why I had left St. John's University. And it was somewhere around 1993 or 1994, 20 years after I had left. My grandmother posed the question to me one day. She said, Robert, I've always wanted to ask, and I just didn't want to know why. What happened? Why did you just leave? Why did you want to quit college when you were doing so well? She said, you could have graduated and gone on to great things. I said, well, I don't know if you knew this, but I said, I thought you knew that, Dad and his new wife, Beverly, had taken me aside and told me that I really needed to quit school because I was putting a great burden on you. And she goes, nothing could be farther from the truth. She said, I think I know what's going on. See, back in Back in 1972, I graduated high school. And I graduated high school with a guy that I knew, didn't know him that well, but he was the son of the woman my dad had married. So we're both at the same age. We're both in colleges. And my dad is supporting his new bride's son to be in college and felt very embarrassed that he wasn't helping me. And it was embarrassing him in front of his parents that they were paying for my education. That's why he wanted me to leave, to save face with his new bride. And my grandmother made it very clear that it was not a financial burden in the least on them. They were actually the ones paying for my brother to go to college and later my sister. And I had walked away from a pretty good education at the time. It broke my heart to realize that I had been lied to. I spent a number of years very estranged from my father, especially in the 1980s and 90s. My late wife and I only visited my father in upstate New York one time around 1976 or 77. And felt very, well, like we were intruding. And so I kept my distance from my dad for a number of years. He reached out to me in 1997 when I had gone back to school at Toccoa Falls and I was training for the ministry. He did attend my ordination. And we began to patch up the damage. It took a long time for me to forgive and forget what my dad and his new bride did to me and took from me in 1974. But you know, God in his mercy and his wisdom gave me a life that I look at it now. What was taken away in 1974 was given back to me in so many ways. No, I never made as much money as my brother David, never probably will. But I've also been in control of who I am. I'm not married to my job. I was given a wonderful wife, and I had a very unusual life. I may have not been the wealthiest person financially, but I certainly enjoyed everything that I did. I really had a passion for the work that I did. In virtually every job I ever had, I loved it. It wasn't work. It was a passion. Whether it was radio, whether it was ministry, whether it was engineering. I look back now and I can see the hand of God in my life. When I made the decision in the 1970s to go do some more tech school and go into engineering, I thought then I'd have to work my way up through a bunch of small market radio stations. I ended up at one of the biggest radio stations in Atlanta, Georgia, as the chief engineer. And from there to work for a transmitter manufacturer, and then a Christian college, to travel like I did, to experience the things that I've experienced. And though I was not as wealthy as some other people that I knew, I was content in what I did and took pride in the work that I did. And I look back to this day without regrets. Yeah, when I got off that bus in Anderson, South Carolina in 1975, I had no idea that before the end of the year of 1975, I'd be married into a ready-made family and launching a very adventurous time in my life. Other people that I knew put up with a lot of struggles and a lot of arguments and a lot of pain. And in spite of the fact I may have not had the financial blessings that some have, I had peace in who I was and in all that I did. And then to go into ministry, in 2004, I lost a wife, and then I spent a number of years in a very dark period in my life. But all that was changed, and I have a great life now again. And so I look at the opportunities that are before me. I'm 65, and I'm technically retired, but I'm not giving up on life. I'm trying to find that place where God has called me to be, to do the things that He wants me to do. That is the most important thing to me today. This radio show probably needs to change direction. I think about it often. We are in a very unique time in our world. We can argue things go in cycles, which they probably do, but we are at a time that is unprecedented in terms of things that are happening around us that 25 years ago, if you even suggested the things that are considered normal now, you would have been treated like you're insane. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of ministry. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of truth. And maybe I'm seeing that's the direction that your weekend show needs to go as a podcast. And maybe it needs to be something more than just a weekend show. Maybe I need to have a couple of short podcasts throughout the week to address issues that are around us. And also later this month of February, here we are in the first weekend of February. Can you believe it? Later on this month, in about 3 weeks, I'm going to be at a conference that may be very life-changing in terms of the things I'll be doing for the foreseeable future after that point. I'll share more later at the end of the month as we get closer to that time. Once again, this is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Bierman. We've been taking a journey down memory lane through music. Don't forget our website, yourweekendshow.com, yourweekendshow.com. One of the fun things about the early part of my broadcast career, and my late wife used to tease about this all the time, that we really needed to have inflatable furniture because we move so much, which is something you do in the radio business as you're working your way up the ladder. And there were times that I remember hearing the song and I felt like I was chasing rainbows and chasing elusive dreams that just didn't seem to pan out from time to time. But ultimately they did. It took about 5 or 6 years of lots of moves and lots of changes and lots of trial and error. I should have bought stock in the U-Haul Corporation. But you know, the experiences that my late wife and I had, she had been a small-town girl that had never seen the United States. Well, she did. And she traveled, and she flew, and she enjoyed every second of it. But you know, when we got a little older and we settled down, we could understand what it means to have explored the world and settled down. And that's why sometimes I can identify with this particular song.
Please come to Boston for the springtime. I'm staying here with some friends and they've got lots of room. And you can sell your paintings on the sidewalk. Buy a cafe where I hope to be working soon. Please come to Boston, she said no. Would you come home to me? And she said, hey rambling boy, now won't you settle down? Boston ain't your kind of town. There ain't no gold and there ain't nobody like me. I'm the number one fan of the man from Tennessee. Please come to Denver with the snowfall. We'll move up into the mountains so farther we can't be found, and throw I love you echoes down the canyons, and then lie awake at night till they come back around. Please come to Denver, she said no. Boy, would you come home to me? And she said, hey, rambling boy, why don't you settle down? Denver ain't your kind of town. There ain't no gold and there ain't nobody like me. 'Cause I'm the #1 fan of the man from Tennessee. Now this drifter's world goes round and round, and I doubt that it's ever gonna stop. But of all the dreams I've lost or found, and all that I ain't got, I still need to lean to somebody I can sing to. Please come to LA to live forever. California life alone is just too hard to build. I live in a house that looks out over the ocean, and there's some stars that fell from the sky and living up on the hill. Please come to LA, she just said no. Boy, won't you come home to me? Hey, rambling boy, why don't you settle down? LA can't be your kind of town. There ain't no gold and there ain't nobody like me. No, no, I'm the #1 fan of the man from Tennessee. I'm the #1 fan of the man from Tennessee.
Well, these past couple of weeks have been a different kind of a journey. I just thought maybe it would be fun. Maybe it was not the best idea. Maybe it was. Maybe you really enjoyed the program. I'll only know if you take the time to let me know. And you can do that by contacting me through the website, yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. I want to thank those of you that do take the time to let me know you listen. It's important. It means a lot. But I'm looking at the direction of this program moving forward. And like I say, this program and last weekends were kind of an experiment, just to have a little bit of fun and play some music and reminisce. But there's something stirring inside of me right now that tells me that this program's direction, the way it is done, probably needs to change just a little bit moving forward. We're coming up on our 5th anniversary of doing your weekend show in just about another month. It was 5 years ago in February of 2015 that I first conceived really of producing this program. I probably had a little bit before that. But I put together the first program as a kind of a news magazine to give it a try. And it aired on WRMI. And I remember the first time I ever heard it on shortwave. I was living in Vero Beach. I had a little radio, and I listened to it on a couple of different frequencies late one night, and wondered how this program would be received. And I've had some fairly decent response over these almost 5 years now. Some programs have had a lot more response than others, and sometimes I can't even explain to you why some shows really had a big response. Others that I thought would be programs I'd hear back from, I heard very little. But there's one thing I've been noticing over the last year or so. While this program is on international shortwave, and it's even on a couple of domestic radio stations. I'm watching a gradual increase in the way people are getting the content as a podcast. And I'm wondering, maybe I need to make the program a little different for a podcast audience, a little different for a radio audience. There's just so many things in my mind right now. I know that we live in a very troubled time, and I want to be a voice of reason, a voice of sanity, and most important, a voice of truth. There are a lot of false teachers, prophets, and people out to get a buck from you that'll write their books and sell you a pack of lies and package it like it's all from God. And you know how I feel about those people. The Bible warns against the false teachers and preachers. And I just want to be able to be a voice out there to help you discern what's really going on in this world today. Not to be led astray, not to be fooled, not to be deceived. And that's important. And also to help you in this journey of life. Well, our time for this weekend has come and gone. Don't forget the website, yourweekendshow.com. That's yourweekendshow.com. Until next week, this is Bob Bierman wishing God's greatest blessings upon you.
On the air and online at yourweekendshow.com.